You feel like you cannot find the right words at the right time, or after you're done speaking, you feel that, hey, I could have said these things more effectively. In that case, we don't really have a knowledge challenge. We generally have an articulation challenge. And for the longest time, I fell into the trap of not being able to communicate articulately. I would speak for minutes on end only for my listener to end up saying, well, what are you really trying to say? This happened at work and in my personal life, but majorly at work itself. When you have your colleagues, you have your managers, and the pressure is on, it gets even harder to articulate your thinking. And for a long time, I thought this is to do with my vocabulary. Only if I knew more words, I could structure my sentences and speak with a more expressive tonality. But after reading many books, after learning a lot of words, I realized that that's not really the problem. It's much more to do with organizing my thinking so that I can speak with more clarity. And that's what articulation really became for me. So I went searching to understand how I can do that effectively, and I found it in this book. It's called The First Minute. It's a very small book by an author called Chris Fenning. Chris is one of my favorite communicators. He's a communication genius because he's learned how to take a very complex topic of speaking concisely and articulating clearly and put it across in a very crisp fashion. In fact, we've been lucky enough to have him on our podcast. The video is on our YouTube channel titled How to Have Conversations That Get Results. But for now, I'm going to break down the essence of this book to help you speak more articulately and with more clarity. By the way, if you're new here, we tend to release communications content all the time for your work and personal life. So hit subscribe if you haven't already. Now, when it comes to vocabulary, many times we think it's about learning new words, which it definitely can be about, but it's also about learning to structure your thoughts so that your communication comes out in a more organized fashion. And with that regard, you don't necessarily need fancy words. We just need to learn certain techniques that help us make our communication a lot more crisp and organized. So let's understand how can we do that better. In this case, I'm not going to go through a lot of theory. I'm in fact directly going to dive into examples of how we generally tend to speak and techniques that can help us become a lot more structured and concise, more important. Keep in mind, this is only for professional situations. Let's go. Example number one is this. So there's a conversation between an employee and a manager. The employee says, hey, you got a minute? So I spoke to some of the developers. Now it's bad. They've been pulling all-nighters for the past 2 weeks and this is causing them a lot of frustration. One of the developers even had to miss their child's birthday and few are on the verge of quitting. Manager, okay. Employee, yeah, so I wanted to ask if you can push the deadline back to help the team be less frustrated and help boost morale. The timeline the client has fixed is too tight. Manager, what project is this for? Employee, all right, this is for the Hamilton project. Now, this exchange took approximately 100 words and the time spent was about 30 plus seconds. How do we crispen and structure this out a lot more? Here's where I would like to introduce you to a technique called as framing. Framing is a technique that helps you organize your thinking. It's something I learned from one of my favorite communication teachers. We had him on our podcast as well. It's a technique that I've been repeatedly applying again and again, and I've seen massive results. The guy I'm talking about is Chris Fenning, and the technique I'm referring to is framing. Now, framing has 3 aspects to it: context, intent, and key message. CIK. Let's start off with context. Context is about what are you talking about? That's all. So you can either name the project or the issue, you can name the process, system, or tool you're talking about, you can give the name of the customer who you're working with, or the task or objective you want to achieve. That's all it is. We start by giving context. Why is this important? Because many times when we are talking to somebody, we are very clear on what we need to talk about. But the other person, even though they might be working with us, they have a bunch of other things going on. And instead of laying that assumption on them, in just one simple sentence, we tell them, hey, I need to talk to you about X, Y, Z. Context is set in just one simple sentence, and then we move ahead. So a few examples of this are listed on the screen over here. After we set the context, then we get into intent. Intent is about why are you communicating? Do we need their help on something? Do we need their advice on something? Are we just informing them about something? That is a thing that has to come second. A few examples over here are in this table, which have the category of intent along with the actual example as well. So the category could be needing help, advice, or input, requesting action, wanting a decision, so on and so forth. So once you have context, you then add the intent. By the way, whenever I show you these example screens, just take a screenshot of it in case you need to go through it in your own time. I'm going to take all 3 of these elements and then show you how we can apply it in the example I just showed you above as well. And finally, you have key message, which is the most important piece of your communication. Over here, you want to ask yourself that why am I delivering this message to this particular person? Before you start writing or talking, think about all the details you can share and then imagine your listener asking, so what or why? Once you do that, you will have your key message right there. And that's the thing that has to come third. So you have your context, intent, and key message. Now let's put this into action with regard to the previous example we just went through, the conversation between the employee and the manager. Now, if you look at the screen over here, what is the context? What are we talking about over here? Over here, we're referring to the Hamilton project. That's the very first thing. That's it. That's the context we need to provide. After this comes the intent. Why are we communicating to this person? What do we want from them? What do we want from them? In this case, we want to have the deadline pushed. That's the intent. You've communicated what the context is. You've told them the intent. Now imagine asking yourself, so what? Or why are you telling me this? Imagine the listener asking you that. Why are we telling them this? The team has a lot of frustration built up in them, and some members are on the verge of quitting because of the timeline the client has fixed being too tight. That is the key message. Now, if you put this into one simple flow, the context will be, I need to speak to you regarding the Hamilton project. Would like to request you to push the deadline by 2 days. The impossible timeline has really lowered morale and some members are on the verge of quitting. Context, intent, and key message. If you notice from the initial example to this, on one level, the entire communication has gotten a lot more crisp. On the other hand, because of the structure we are providing to it, it's a lot easier for us to find the right word at the right time and communicate accordingly. That's where CIK or the framing technique becomes very, very important. The amount of words the previous one took was 100. This one just takes 40. The amount of time the previous entire conversation took was more than half a minute. This one is just done in 12 seconds. And always remember that in this case, framing is just to start a particular conversation. It's not the entire conversation. It's context, intent, key message followed by the rest of the conversation, depending on what you're speaking about. So that's the first aspect of you speak. And when your initial aspect is nice and organized, there's a much higher chance that the rest of your conversation and communication will come across in a much more organized fashion as well. Now that you have a good sense of how to structure your communication effectively, you need to know how to deliver it with impact as well. That's where your tonality and modulation become crucial. We've created an entire video to help you understand how to modulate effectively, and you can check out that entire video right here.